People always assume the hardest part of my job was watching people die. They're wrong. The hardest part was the ones who didn't. My name is Ryan Calloway. I spent 11 years driving an ambulance for Mercer County Emergency Medical Services in a mid-sized city in the American South. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody's business, where churches fill up on Sunday mornings, and the diner on 5th Street still serves sweet tea in mason jars. People there had a way of talking about death like it was a neighbor you'd eventually have to invite in, polite about it, respectful. Like if you minded your manners, it would be courteous enough not to come too soon. I believed that once. I don't anymore. I started riding in ambulances at 22, fresh out of EMT certification, full of that particular brand of idealism that only survives about 8 months in emergency medicine before the world beats it clean out of you. My partner for most of those years was a man named Gerald Moss, 50-something, heavy-set, the kind of quiet competence that makes you feel safe just standing next to him. Gerald had been doing the job since before I was born. He'd seen things I couldn't imagine, and he'd developed the emotional armor to prove it. Not cold, just sealed, like a house where all the windows have been locked from the inside. He trained me well. He taught me how to move fast without rushing, how to read a scene before the doors were even open, how to speak calmly to people whose worlds were falling apart. What he never taught me, what no one teaches you, is what to do when the calls stop making sense. The first one that unsettled me happened in my 3rd year on the job. We got a call at 2:17 in the morning. Cardiac event, residential address on the east side of town. Standard enough. We arrived to find a man in his late 60s collapsed in his living room, wife beside him, hands pressed to her mouth, still in her nightgown. He had no pulse. I started compressions while Gerald prepped the defibrillator. 3 shocks. Nothing. His color was wrong, not the gray of fresh cardiac arrest, but the pale, waxy stillness of someone who had been gone longer than the dispatch time suggested. Gerald and I shared a look over the body without speaking. When we'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between a person you might bring back and a person you were performing ritual on. We worked him for 22 minutes before Gerald quietly said, "Time of death, 2:41 a.m. The wife broke down. We radioed it in. Routine. Except on the drive back, Gerald was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't drink from his coffee thermos. He stared at the road with his jaw tight and didn't say a word until we pulled back into the bay. Then he said, "That man's name was Harold Greer." I waited. I brought Harold Greer in 2 years ago. Similar call. His heart stopped in the grocery store parking lot. We worked him for 31 minutes, Ryan. 31 minutes. No pulse, no response. And the attending at Mercy declared him dead on arrival. I stared at him. He walked out of that hospital 4 days later, Gerald said. Doctors called it spontaneous recovery. Said his heart must have restarted on its own sometime between us and the ER. He finally looked at me. I know what a dead man feels like. I've held enough of them. Harold Greer was dead in that parking lot. He got out of the ambulance. He never brought it up again. I told myself it was one of those stories that grows in the telling, that Gerald's memory had softened the details, that medicine is full of extraordinary recoveries that look miraculous from the outside. I had a good career going. I wasn't going to let ghost stories rattle me. That held for about 2 more years. The call came on a Thursday evening in late October. A young woman, mid-20s, if found unresponsive in her apartment by her roommate. When we arrived, the roommate was outside on the steps, shaking, unable to speak coherently. We went in. The young woman, her name was Della Fitch, I learned later, was lying across her bed in her work clothes, still wearing her shoes like she'd come home and simply stopped. Her eyes were half open. Her skin was cold. Not room temperature cold. Cold the way things get when warmth has been absent for a while. Gerald checked her pupils while I checked her pulse. Nothing on both counts. We looked at each other. Same look as before. We worked her. Compressions, airway, everything in the protocol. The roommate appeared in the doorway crying, asking if she was going to be okay. Gerald gently asked her to wait outside. We kept working. She came back in the ambulance. Her heart did not restart, because she was declared at the hospital at 8:54 p.m. I drove home that night thinking about the way her skin had felt. Cold in a way that didn't match the timeline. The roommate said she'd spoken to Dell on the phone at 6:30 that evening, just over 2 hours before we arrived. A healthy 26-year-old does not go cold in 2 hours. I didn't sleep well, but I told myself, bodies are strange. Medicine is full of things we don't fully understand. Della Fitch was photographed at a convenience store on the north side of town 11 days later. I know this because Gerald called me on my day off to tell me. His voice was completely flat when he said it. A cashier at the store recognized her from the news coverage of her death. Her family had done a small memorial piece in the local paper and called the police. By the time officers arrived, she was gone. No one could explain it. The official position from the department, after some quiet back and forth with the hospital, was that there had been a misidentification, that Della Fitch had not actually died, that there had been an error somewhere in the chain. Gerald and I both signed off on that call. We both know what we found in that apartment. There was no error. I want to be careful here about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I am not saying I believe in resurrection. I am not saying I have a theory about what was happening. What I'm telling you is what I experienced over the course of 11 years, and I'll let you come to your own conclusions. After Della Fitch, I started keeping notes. Nothing official, just a small notebook I kept in my locker, entries written after shifts when something felt wrong. Not wrong in a medical sense, wrong in the way that certain places feel wrong at certain hours, the way the air in a room changes before a storm. I logged 12 entries over the next 4 years. Not all of them were dramatic. Some were small things. A patient whose vitals read one way at the scene and completely differently by the time we reached the hospital. A man who told me his name and address clearly and coherently while I was working to stabilize him from what should have been a fatal fall, only to lose consciousness before we arrived and never regain it, dying without ever explaining how he'd spoken to me. A woman who I was certain, absolutely certain, blinked while I was moving her onto the stretcher, whose chart would later list her time of death as 40 minutes before we were called. Small things. Things you could explain away one at a time. Things that accumulate into something heavier if you're paying attention. Gerald retired in my 8th year. His retirement party was at a steakhouse on the edge of town. He drank 2 glasses of bourbon, which was more than I'd ever seen him drink, and he pulled me aside near the end of the evening and said something I've thought about almost every day since. "This job will show you things that don't belong to the living," he said. "I've been trying to figure out for 30 years whether that's a feature or a flaw." He looked at his glass. "I still don't know." He squeezed my shoulder once and walked away. The call that ended my career came on a Tuesday in February, my 11th year on the job. Dispatch sent us to an address I recognized, a house on Crescent Mill Road. You're out past the edge of the older neighborhoods, where the streetlights thin out and the yards get bigger. I'd been there once before, years earlier, for a call that had gone in my notebook. A man named Thomas Aldrich, found unresponsive by his adult son. We'd worked him, lost him, transported him. He died at the hospital. Thomas Aldrich had been 71 at the time, which would have made him 78 if he was still alive. The call was for a 78-year-old male, unresponsive, at the same address. My new partner that year was a young woman named Carla. Excellent instincts, calm under pressure, completely unprepared for what I was carrying into that house. I said nothing to her on the drive over. I told myself it was coincidence. It's a small city. Addresses repeat. Thomas Aldrich was dead. We went inside. The man on the floor of the living room was old and still and colorless. His son, a man in his 50s now, grayer than I remembered, heavier, stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides. I knelt beside the man. I put my fingers to his neck, and Thomas Aldrich opened his eyes. Not like a man waking up, not like someone disoriented by a fall. His eyes opened fully and completely, and he looked at me with an expression I have never been able to adequately describe. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't fear. It was something more like recognition, like a man who has been waiting in a dark room for a specific person to open the door. He said, You were there before? I couldn't speak. The last time, he said. His voice was rough and low, like something dragged up from a long distance. Aunt, you were there. Carla was already beside me, checking his airway, running through protocol. She looked at me sideways when I didn't respond. Thomas Aldrich closed his eyes again. His pulse returned. Faint, irregular, but present. We transported him. He survived. He spent 6 days in the ECU and was discharged to a rehabilitation facility. I submitted my resignation 2 weeks later. I've had a lot of time to think about those 11 years since I left the service. I work at a hardware store now, the kind of work where the problems are concrete and the solutions are on the shelf and nothing looks at you from the floor with eyes that shouldn't be open. I've never been able to fully explain what I saw. I've thought about it from every angle I know. I've considered the possibility that grief and fatigue and the cumulative weight of the job distorted my perception in ways I couldn't detect. I've considered that medicine is full of recoveries that look impossible from the outside. I've considered that Gerald was right, that there are things in this work that don't belong to the living, and that some of them pass through your hands on their way somewhere else. What I keep coming back to is the look on Thomas Aldrich's face. That was not a man waking up. That was not confusion or disorientation or the fog of a medical event. That was a man who recognized me, a man who had seen me before, not in life, but in whatever space exists between the moment the body stops and the moment the paperwork says it did. I don't know what that space is. I don't know who lives there, or what they remember, or why some of them come back and most of them don't. I just know that I've held enough hands on that border to understand that the line we draw between living and dead is one that we drew, not one that nature drew for us. And some nights, when I'm trying to sleep and the house is quiet, I think about Della Fitch walking into that convenience store. I think about Harold Greer leaving the hospital. I think about the 12 entries in that notebook, which I still have, in a box in the back of my closet. I think about what Thomas Aldrich meant when he said, "You were there before," and I wonder how many of them remember me, and I wonder if they're the only ones keeping count. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I don't need anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I'd believe me if I hadn't lived it. And I tell it because I think some of you work jobs like I work, or you love someone who does, and maybe you've had a moment on a night shift where something felt wrong in a way you couldn't name, where a room felt off, where a patient looked at you just a half second too long, or spoke when they shouldn't have been able to, or was gone in a way that the timeline didn't support. If you've had that moment, you're not crazy, you're not overtired, you're paying attention. Gerald Moss passed away 4 years after he retired. Natural causes, his daughter told me when she called. Peaceful, she said, in his sleep. I hope so. I genuinely hope so. I hope that when Gerald crossed that border he'd spent 30 years holding vigil at, he found it as quiet on the other side as he always made it seem. I hope no one was waiting for him with recognition in their eyes. I hope he got to be done, because some of the ones I carried, I don't think they ever were.